So this debate is about separation or integration, and mostly it exists when people have differences amongst each other. It's a question of should we separate them or should we put them together? It's somewhat linked to internal versus external change debates. So should you leave the group? Should you stay within the group? But this will talk more about difference and how to sort out and reconcile those differences. So sample motions. That in countries with a history of ethnic tensions, you would embrace cultural appropriation. This house supports single-sex primary and secondary schools. And this house supports federalism in X country. So things that, in essence, separate groups of people, put them within particular institutions. And it's a question of, is that better? So the first question is, what are the means of contact? Meaning, when you put them together, if you are intending to do that, how are they likely to work with one another? So is this on there's often, what do you call this, contact theory arguments that are made on debate that if you are in contact with another group you will build empathy, understanding, etc. I think that's possible, right? And I'm sure we have all had experiences where more personal experiences with an individual could inform us about who they are, make us more close to them, their group of people, their heritage, etc. But there are also instances where that might make people more antagonistic towards one another. So this could be true, but you have to assess the means by which that contact exists to begin with. So question one, is this on fair grounds? Are there reasons for a more powerful party to push for fairness? Meaning, let's say there is some degree of inequality that might already make the means of contact less good, because if one group assumes themselves to be superior over another group, continuously being in contact with one another does not necessarily mean that they're becoming more empathetic, especially if they're being cruel and dehumanizing to one another. So if there is inequality, or if there is inequality and there's no reason for the more powerful party to want fairness and equality, then I'm not sure that would lead to more understanding. So you have to ask this first question. Second is, are their interactions meaningful and humanizing? So you have to ask, what are the ways by which they interact? Do they get to actually and genuinely understand each other's culture? Do you actually get to understand historical aspects about this individual, etc.? So in the earlier motion about cultural appropriation, one of the things you could argue against cultural appropriation is to say that oftentimes you don't get a meaningful understanding of that culture. You just pick and choose the parts of it that you like the most and ignore the rest of it. And that's why cultural appropriation is often an unproductive activity. Third is, are they put in competition or at odds with one another? So if they're in a situation where they're forced to fight for resources, for power, etc., then that might not also bode well because that gives incentives for them to put each other down. On the other hand, if they are encouraged to set aside differences and work with one another, that might instead give reasons for which you can build positive rapport and contact with different groups of people. So, in general, this slide is just because you were in the same room doesn't necessarily mean you're building empathy or understanding. In fact, the opposite could be true. You want to assess what are the kinds of interactions we're building up. Next is a question of differences. So are the differences between these groups entirely irreconcilable, or can they fade? Meaning, if you think that these differences can never be changed, that they will always be antagonistic towards one another, then I think separation could be the best thing to do. Whereas if over time they might fade, then perhaps integration is a worthwhile prospect. So first, are these differences brought about by historical events and relationships that will always have some kind of scars or some kind of mark between these two groups and therefore will make it very difficult to put aside differences? Second, are these differences caused by shared structures, systems, or resources? So for example, if the reason they are antagonistic towards one another is that they're fighting for oil, if they're fighting for land, if they're fighting for the same kinds of slots of power, then it might not be good to put them in the same area because you're putting them through the same structures and systems that cause conflict to begin with. Lastly, are these differences caused by a lack of understanding of the other side? So if you think that just by getting to know each other better, understanding the other side more, they will be able to be more sympathetic and understand what they like, that could possibly be a reason for which these differences could fade over time. I think a good example of that is single-sex schools, where I think more exposure to the opposite sex will hopefully lead to people thinking that, like stereotypes about girls and boys aren't true, that there's a lot more depth to it, and being exposed to different types of girls and boys to break up those kinds of like perceptions and stereotypes built up by media, that students might end up inculcating. The next thing you want to consider is alternative points of contact. And what I mean by this is, oftentimes, the separation won't be like a full separation. There will be points in which they will be forced into contact with one another at some point. So, for example, if you have single sex primary and secondary schools, it's not like girls and boys at that age will never meet someone of the opposite sex, right? They will do it through like other means, maybe like in their neighborhoods, whatever other extracurricular activities they might have, etc. So, you want to ask, one, how much is this contact limited? And does this significantly reduce the amount of other kinds of contact that can occur? Meaning, maybe they'll still meet at times. Are those times a significant amount, or is that very, very few and far between? But second is, how does separation affect these alternative points of contact? So, for example, in motions that are, this house supports the partition of X country, I think one of the strongest opposition arguments that you can make is that when you have two separate countries that are oftentimes built on ethnicity as their main identity, then when you have a partition, there's a very, very high likelihood that they go to war with one another, because the way in which you win an election is now not catering to everyone in that group, not by trying to build a unifying stance, but instead catering to a specific ethnicity, a specific group, and therefore saying that this other group is the enemy, we should go to war, riling up nationalistic sentiments is a winning strategy in an election, for example. And so, how does separation then impact the other ways in which they could possibly interact with one another? So, similarly, just for the single sex primary and secondary schools, I'd argue that just like, I'd make the argument, for example, on op, that once you get to college or the workplace, like boys and girls will just have very, I think especially boys, admittedly, will have much more stereotypical views of women, and that could lead to very negative interactions once they get to the workplace. So asking yourself, what are the alternative points of contact beyond the motion, and how is that affected? Lastly is, you want to look at how marginalized groups will be affected. So how does separation and integration affect them? So do they have more or less access to positions of power after separation? I think one of the best arguments, for example, for girls-only schools is that because you have to fill in positions, for example, in sports teams, it's much better for girls in their development, because oftentimes they will be either discriminated by like fellow like schoolmates, or even people like teachers, people in positions of authority that think that sports are only for boys, etc. Or even integrated like, or more integrated like bodies like student council, for example. Sexism can play a very big role in how like leaders are decided, and people thinking that like boys make better leaders for some reason. All these different kinds of things, and maybe separating girls could allow them more spots in which they could develop and form these kinds of like rules for themselves. Second, do they lose access to resources after separation? So if you have a marginalized group that maybe would want to make their own country, you could make the argument that that country would not succeed economically. They'll have a lot of difficulty. The way in which borders are decided would be very difficult as well. Third, are they pushed around when integration occurs? So even if they're in one like state, for example, maybe they're always losing elections. Maybe there's a quote unquote unity or nationalism, but really it doesn't represent anything meaningful, and that would be a negative thing. So these are the different aspects you want to consider for these kinds of debates.